Here we are, 1 Kings chapter 7, beginning at verse 3. Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. And they said to each other, "Why stay here?" This is what I want you to underline, because this is the question for all of us to contemplate every single day as those who are not only just followers of Jesus Christ, but are committed disciples of Jesus Christ that are obedient in terms of mission. This is our question, all right? Let's read it together. Why stay here until we die? I almost heard you. Let's do it again. Why stay here until we die? Good question, right? It's really a question of leadership. Leadership sometimes asks this question. Why stay here until we die? Verse 4, if we say we'll go into the city, the famine is there, and we will die. And if we stay here, we will die. Now, in a moment, we'll jump in and I'll do some explanation about the text and help you understand. But because we're talking about men who had leprosy, I wanted to give you a few stats on leprosy. It's not something we hear about. You did not hear this week that your neighbor has leprosy. It's almost eradicated across the planet, but there are some things. It's 2 Kings. I'm sorry. No wonder some of you were having trouble. 2 Kings, chapter 7. Thank you so much. That's the first mistake this year. It's like, none. All right, some things that you probably didn't want to know, but you learned about leprosy. India is the leading center for leprosy. The nation of India accounts for 50% of all new leprosy cases in the world. Leprosy, it can spread in an instant, but it can take seemingly forever to incubate. In some cases, the incubation period has been greater than 20 years. Even in regular cases, leprosy may take 2 to 8 years to become an active infection in the body. Leprosy is not a fan of rifampicin, I think is how you pronounce it. It's a drug that has remarkable powers that eliminate the bacteria that causes leprosy. And that's why it's mostly been eradicated in the world. It's got a nasty relative. Leprosy is caused by a bacteria that is in the same family as tuberculosis. Leprosy has been, as we said before, eradicated in many places. In the UK, the last case of indigenous leprosy was diagnosed in 1798. About 12 new cases are diagnosed in countries without the disease every year. And most of them affect people between 20 and 30 demographic. Now, does that cheer you up, those of you who are in 20 and 30 demographics? I wanted to give you a little background about some of the stats, modern stats for leprosy. But in the day that these men lived, it was more common. And there were actually colonies and places where there were lepers in maybe almost every city, in almost every town, almost every place in ancient times. Now, these are 4 lepers of ancient times that were kind of sentenced to the outside of the city walls. And they were making a home out there as best they could. You can kind of imagine, if you let your mind wander, that they had some kind of a shade covering to sit under in the day. They had their campfire outside, and they were not welcomed in the city for obvious reasons. It was a contagion, and people didn't want to catch what they had, but they were at the mercy of people coming in and out of the city that would toss them a loaf of bread or perhaps money to go buy things. And so they were beggars, and they were people who were outside of the city and not welcomed into the city. Real leadership will often arise when we go into difficult or impossible situations. The leader inside of us will really kind of stand up. And such is the case is what we're going to read about today. But the clock was ticking on these lepers on how they were going to survive, because what we're going to read about or study about that was happening was eliminating the possibility for them to get the food that they needed to survive each day. The clock was really ticking on them as to how long they were going to be able to survive. And I was thinking this week that the clock is ticking for our world. We know that Jesus is coming back, and the clock is ticking for us to have an opportunity to share the good news, the opportunity for those who don't know Jesus to get to know him and to have a relationship with him and to come into the family of God. That clock is ticking as well. Our time is running short. Our time is, we talked about last week that there are 2 dates that are set for you and I that are fixed, and God set them. He set the date of our beginning, and he set the date of our end, and they're fixed times, and so we are living in the dash. We're living in between the beginning and the end of our time, and we don't know how long that is, but even if it was lengthy, and we thought we would live to be 90 or 100, those are very brief moments on the planet in reality. And we don't have a lot of time, and our time is running out for sharing the good news, for doing what God's called us to do, for being engaged in mission. Our opportunity to share with others about Jesus is running short. Some cases we might say, hey, I think that, I can talk to my neighbor next week, or I can talk to my neighbor, in a month or so from now. We're not promised that. The clock is ticking on us. Time is running short. We asked the question last year, if you knew you had 52 hours to live, what would you be doing with that time? How would you spend that time? And I think many of us would really make some severe calibrations to how we're spending every day. That every moment would be precious. Probably some of us who've never done it before would be setting an alarm really early in the morning. And we would get the fullest amount of time out of our day that we possibly could if we knew we only had 52 hours to go. It would challenge us. We would think about life differently. These 4 men who had leprosy were at the gates of the city, but they were also, where you and I are this morning, at the gates of decision. They were at the gates of decision, an opportunity that stands before them to make a decision to do something that will change their circumstance. And the question that they asked was, why are we sitting here until we die? Why are we letting time just clip by? There's a beginning, there's an ending. Why are we allowing time to just escape and pass by? Why are we just sitting here waiting for death? This is where those of you who are going to be artists in the future are so excited that I'm going to give you some basic training. All right? Because if you've ever struggled with, your art, then you're going to feel very encouraged in just moments. You're going to want to take this on as a life pattern for you. I'm going to be an artist. I want to explain to you a little bit about what was going on in the text. In ancient times, they practiced warfare. One style of warfare that was practiced was called the siege. Now the siege was, this is the city walls here. The siege was where the army would surround the city. And the intent is that they would cut off all of the supply areas that the city might normally engage in to, if they were going to go out and get food, if they were going to have commerce, they were going to bring food in, sell their goods and their wares to people to provide and have an economy of any kind, that the surrounding army would cut that off altogether. They can't leave the city to go out and work their farms. They can't welcome anyone into their city who's going to bring any kind of commerce that is going to help them to survive and carry on. Now, one of the reasons that the siege was a popular tactic for some of the ancient armies of the day was that it limited casualties. If they were to go and against this city and the walls and the gates, they were going to have a lot of casualties. And so when they set up the siege, they basically just come to live there for whatever season it's going to be until that place, that city, decides to give up and surrender. They're starving to death, they're in famine, whatever. And we're jumping into this story when the city is already starting to experience famine because the Syrian army has surrounded this city and they no longer have food. Now, no one, in ancient times when the armies came to do this, they didn't know how long it would take because some cities might have been well fortified and they might be able to survive for some time. In rare cases, maybe a year plus, the city could go on without having to surrender. But many times it was just weeks or months before a city would have to make some kind of decision. And so as we jump into our story, this is what we find the situation is. They had, the Syrian army had laid siege to the city. And so here we have our little heroes up here. Just draw out 4 of these guys. There they are. I won't even put the stick figures for them. And they are near the city gates. They can't go in. Even if they could go in, you know, people open the gate, could quick get in here because the army's out there. There's no food in there. There's no hope in there. There's nothing in there for them. And obviously they can't escape. They're surrounded. And so they're in the same situation, except they don't have the walls to protect them. And the army has laid siege, and they're cutting off every road, every pathway into the city, every opportunity, every place of hope they are cutting off from this city. Now, the intent here is to starve them out and get them to surrender eventually. And so this was where our heroes of the story find themselves in this predicament. 4 lepers at the gate of the city. They have no food, no welcome in the city because of the famine, and they're surrounded by the Syrians. And this is where we read again. So if you have your passage, let's jump into what we read a moment ago. Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. And they said to each other, "Why stay we here until we die? If we say we'll go into the city, the famine is there and we will die." And so these 4 lepers were facing a crisis situation. They needed to call a board meeting, all right? And some leadership needed to rise out of that. And so they needed more really than a meeting, right? They needed action. They needed to decide how they were going to move forward. If we stay here at the gates of the city, we're going to die. If we try to go into the city, we're going to die. There's no food in there. There's people at this. In some cases, people are starting to eat people in situations where the siege is taking place. So this is not a good place to be going, right? And so the next verse says, "So let's go over," this is the lepers talking, "let's go over to the camp of the Syrians and surrender. If they spare us, we live, and if they kill us, then we die." The operative question was, why are we sitting here until we die? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. Let's change up here. Let's do something different. Let's do something bold. Let's take a risk. Let's make a move. Let's try something. We know what we have here, and we know what we have here. What the unknown is what's there. And so they decided, hey, let's try this. Let's go over and talk to them. It's possible, not probable, but possible that these guys have a little mercy. And they'll toss us some bread and let us walk through their ranks, and we can go on somewhere else where, there's not, impending war, where there's an opportunity for us to get together. Maybe we'll find another colony with people like us, and we'll find some people who have pity on us and bring food and water and those kinds of things. Let's try it. Let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens. And so in verse 5, it says, "At dusk, they got up, and they went to the camp of the Arameans," which is actually the Syrians. "And when they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there." Now listen to this, verse 6. For the Lord had caused the Syrians to hear the sound of the chariots and horses and a great army. And so they had said to one another, look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and Egyptian kings to attack us. And so they got up and fled in dusk, and read this with me, and abandoned their tents and their horses and donkeys. They left camp as it was and ran for their lives. These guys took off. Now, what you need to understand about this story was Israel did not hire armies to come in to help them out. This was an act of God on this army that was laying siege to the city. An act of God that they heard what was not there. They smelt, tasted, and felt what was not there. The sounds that God was putting in their ears and their minds and their hearts as if a mighty army was coming on them. And it happened in such a way that these guys didn't pack, right? They thought their lives were at risk, and they ran as fast as they could. They left everything that they had set up. Now remember, they had been laying siege for some time. They had all of their supplies, everything that they needed in place. And when this happened, they jumped up and ran off as fast as they could and left everything behind. They left their horses behind, they left their donkeys behind. They left every single thing they had behind. Here's what happened for our heroes. They hit the ancient lottery. The decision to act was rewarded with a bounty. All they did was ask themselves the question, we are just sitting here. We are just waiting for death to come. We got to do something. There must have been a little bit of puffed upness that they felt about themselves. Like, yeah, you better get out of here. All right? Yeah, we were coming for you guys. You better run, you know. They walked right into a bounty, right? Verse 8, read with me. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered one of the tents, and ate and drank. Can you imagine this? You know, like this dude was getting ready to have breakfast, and he hears the coming of an army. He takes off. He's already poured his bowl of cereal. You know, he's got the toast is ready. Everything. You know, campfires are still going, right? The bacon is simmering, and these guys walk right into it. Like, it's already been prepared. It's been made. I was just sat down, and they ate, and they drank immediately. Like, I was thirsty. I was hungry. I took a risk. We said to ourselves, why are we sitting here till we die? Let's go and check this place out. And now I'm eating, and I'm drinking some pretty good food, pretty good drink. And then it says, look at this. Then they took silver and gold. See, these guys split and left everything. They left their wallets, right? Everything. Silver, gold, clothes, and they went off and hid themselves, hid this stuff somewhere. They would find a bunch of stuff. They said, we're going to come back for this later. And they picked up a rock and threw this under here. They marked the rock in some way so they knew where they were going to come back to, and took off and went back to camp to find some more, right? And so then they went off with them, and they returned and entered into another tent and took some things from it, and they went and hid those things also. They were building up a bounty, man. Just, you know, this is like banking for the future, right? This is going to take care of me for not only this next year, but this one's going to take care of me for the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. I might even start my own small business, you know. They were just collecting stuff, running from tent to tent. And it was like hitting the lottery. It was so wonderful. And every place they went was full of something that they could grab a hold of. And they were grabbing it as fast as they could. And then they felt as if they were kind of hitting the lottery and things were going well for them. And then they kind of began to ask a question of themselves that we ask at the beginning of this message is, what should we be doing with good news? And here it is in verse 9. Then they said to each other, What are we doing? This is not right. This is a day of good news, and we've been keeping it to ourselves. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace. What are we doing? This is a day of good news. What are we doing with this good news? We're hoarding up for ourselves. We're providing for our future. We're living the life of bounty and the life of goodness. But we know people in the city. They probably had family members there and cousins and aunts and uncles and friends and people who had helped them out in times of need. And they said, we're taking all of this for ourselves. What are we doing? What are we doing? This is not right either. If you had the cure for cancer and you had it in a bottle and there's hospitals full of people who have cancer and you had the cure for it, what would you be doing with that cure? And yet you and I have the cure for broken hearts, for troubled minds, for people that are in bondage of any kind. We have the cure. We know the cure. Bill Hybels, a former pastor of Willow Creek, was sharing a story of how he had a friend over who was not a Christian and is a dear friend, somebody he had known all of his life. And this friend is getting ready to leave, and it's it's beginning to lightly snow outside, and he walks him out to his car. God is speaking to Bill about, sharing his faith one more time with this man. Many times over the course of these years, he's shared his faith and he's tried to encourage this friend of his to make Jesus the Lord and the leader of his life. So as he's walking out to the car, he's thinking through what he's going to say and feeling the challenge of God for him to invite him to know Jesus. And as the gentleman gets in the car with his window down, last parting words, he just says, many times I've tried to share my faith with you. I know you know how much I love Jesus and that he's first in my life. And I've tried to share with you many times that how important it is to know Jesus and to make him the Lord and the leader of your life. But this last time that I get a chance to talk with you today about this, I just want to say this. I cannot imagine living in heaven without my best friend. And with those words, they said their last goodbyes. He rolled his window up and he drove off. It was many, many months later that he calls Bill and tells him that not only has he recently found Jesus and made him the Lord and leader of his life, but he has a home church where he lives. He's attending faithfully. And he's beginning to grow up in Christ. And he said, the one thing that I could not get away from over these last several months was your statement that you can't imagine living in heaven without your best friend. And I wanted to call to tell you, you don't have to. You don't have to. We can be there together. As we think through what we're doing with good news, I want to share this story with you. When we first moved to Las Vegas, I was getting ready to start a small business. It took a little while for them to do a build out on the business. And while that was taking place, I went to work in a place there just a few hours a day, just kind of one of the employees. And just something to do and to get a chance to meet some people there. And one of the persons that I met there was a young lady by the name of Jennifer Baker. Jennifer said later, she told us later in the story, that when she found out that my background was a pastor, she was hoping that she wouldn't have to work with me. It's like that's just an awful thing to have a religious person around. And they're just going to be relentless. And, I've already made decisions for my life and I'm not interested in that. And yet, as we worked together over the coming weeks and months, she began to let her guard down, began to ask questions about Christianity, began to engage with me at times that we had opportunity about the things that I was interested in relationship to Jesus Christ. She met our family. Our family sometimes would come into the place that we were doing business there, and she would get a chance to meet them. And so our first invitation was for her to come to our home, to get to know us better. She began to really enjoy being around the family, not just Michelle and I, but the kids and everybody who was engaged in relationship there. She began to come with us then on Saturday night. We had made Saturday night in our home church. That was the place that, the time that we went to church. And it was a large mega church. There was, even on Saturday night, it was probably 700 or 800 people that were there. And we took up a large section because we were inviting people. Michelle was engaged in work there, and she was inviting people from her work, and those rows began to grow. We were talking to people, and pretty soon it was like, there would be 10, 12, 15 people sometimes just on our row, our section, of people that we had talked to or invited or wanted to come and be with us. And what they really loved, that we had a little hook in it, that would get them there, was that not only would we have fun on the row, and as we're in service and enjoy what was being said and taught and the songs and all that, but after it was all over, we would come over to our house and have food. That was, food, man. We would have hamburgers, or we would have just whatever was going on. And so there were many, many times there was 15, 20, 25 people coming over to our house after church to sit around and have food, Now, you can't have food, you can't come in if you didn't come to church. So we all went to church together, then we all came home and had food, and we hung out, and we just had a wonderful time together. Jennifer, I started watching what was happening in her life. I want to ask you to think through this as we kind of diagram this out on the board. Where are people that relationships that you have, friends that you have, where are they with respect to meeting Jesus and coming to know Him? I wouldn't put Jennifer at necessarily a negative 10, but she was probably more a negative 8 or a negative 6, right? So as we go through this and think, where are some of the people in our lives in terms of making a relationship? The really cool thing was, over the next several months, I got to watch Jennifer, begin to progress, right? So she moved from a negative 8 to a negative 6, from a negative 6 to a negative 4. I knew she was at a negative 2 when she was asking me, when are we going to church again? Or, what's happening? And she began to talk to me more about like when it's happening. Instead, it was back here in the beginning, I was always having to remind her, remember, come to church. And now it was like, here she is, and I'm bringing a friend and that kind of thing, And so I knew there was progress taking place. She got to about, I would say, a negative 1. She got to a negative 1. And we had to take a trip. We went back to Arizona. There was something going on. Somebody was graduating from high school. Something was happening. We had to go over that weekend and be gone. Would you know that was the weekend that Jennifer walked the aisle and made Jesus Christ the Lord and the leader of her life? I got a phone call, found out about it, and I'm like, bummer. What is wrong? All this work, and I didn't get to walk with her down to the front. Michelle and I didn't get to escort her all the way to the front. She walked the aisle with a whole bunch of strangers when we were gone, right? She made her way down to make Jesus the Lord and the leader of her life. The good news was I got to participate in her baptism. And that was a beautiful thing. And her dad came down. He's from Northern California. And her dad came down, and he wanted to meet with me. And we got together, and he said, he's a Christian. And he said, I want to thank you and your family for reaching my daughter. He said, I've talked to her many times over the years about making a decision for Jesus. And I've not always set the best example. I wasn't the best person early in my life. But I just thank God for putting you and your family in the pathway of the daughter I love and care about. She talks about you guys all the time. She loves you guys so much. She loves your family. And it means everything that she has made a decision for Jesus Christ. And to be here today, and her dad also helped in the baptism. And there we were after she had made a commitment to Christ. helping baptize her into the family of God. We don't always, know where people are. Sometimes we do. But we have a role to play in mission. And I was thinking this morning that one of the important things for us to understand is that we have a role to play, and pastors and ministers and teachers of the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ are going to do what I've been doing ever since I've been here, and that is invite you to get in mission. Invite you to get involved in the mission of Jesus Christ, what He's given us. What is that mission? We've spelled it out for our church, Luke 19:10. Jesus said, I came to seek and to save that which is lost. That's the mission. That's the priority of God. Jesus is the head of the church. And if your head, if your body starts doing things your head's not telling it to do, go see the doctor, right? But I don't understand why the Church of Jesus Christ is acting that way. They're doing things that the head didn't tell them to do. If we get off of this target, there's a lot of good things we can do as a church, but if we get out of this, if we start getting into politics, if we start getting into all kinds of other things. I had a question this week from someone who says, what's your position with a certain community? I don't have a position with a certain community. I have a position with Jesus Christ. Yes. To preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news. And that is my everyday mission when I wake up. I don't have to wonder, what has God called me to do today? It's like, I know what He's called me to do. He's probably set some divine appointments, right? And I'm just supposed to arrive and water a little bit. I might move somebody from a -10 to a -9. So I met a Christian today, and I hate Christians, but I met a Christian today that I actually liked. He moved from 10 to 9. I actually met somebody who loved Jesus, who is doing something positive. And it moved me. And I've often thought about this with respect to people that are in our lives. Where are they? Sometimes we kind of know, sometimes we don't. As I saw her getting closer to this point, I knew that we got here. It would probably just be an ask, like, are you ready? I'll go with you, But unfortunately, I had to go on vacation, and she went without me. So, where are people in your life? Each of us was given an invite card last week, and I'm not sure if we have them here today. Do we have some here? Okay. So we're gonna hand some out to you today. And ask if some of our ushers and helpers would come and do that. We're going to dispense them out. I'm going to give you a little bit of time on your invite card to personalize it, to write a name on there, somebody that you're thinking about. I know you did this last week. We're going to do it every week leading into Easter, so you better get another friend, right? If you just had one friend, you're like, that's it, I don't have anybody else, you better find another one, right? Join a bunco club, walk into a strange place and introduce yourself. I say, I'll be back next week with a card. Your favorite Starbucks person, the mailman, whoever it might be. Write their name or their if you don't know their name, they're an acquaintance, you just write down the guy who is the barista on Mondays, or whatever it is, The girl at the window when I drive through Starbucks. We're going to write a name down. And what I want you to realize, these envelopes are huge, so if you want to put a letter in there or something else, we didn't originally intend them to be this large. They came this large. But the reason I wanted you to have this visual in front of you is because that's not just an envelope and that's not just a card, that's a life. That's a life. That's a life that needs to move from a 10 to an 8 to a 6 to a 4 to a 2 to a 1 to a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's somebody that you won't see in heaven if you don't invite them to come to know Jesus. Now, you may not get to see them cross the line as I didn't with Jennifer, but there's roles that you play. There's people that we left behind in Vegas that some of them that Michelle worked with. that made commitments after we left, but we set an example for them. And we taught them about Jesus, and we loved on them. You know, one of the beautiful things, and I digress a little bit, in this story, I remember a couple of brothers that we were, talking to and inviting, and I know for sure one of them made a commitment to Jesus Christ. But one of the things that happened with these guys was they were from South America, and they had a view of white middle-class people that they had kind of been raised with. And because we loved on them and we brought them into our home and they were part of the family and we treated them like family, these guys had a journey there too that moved them. And they came and told Michelle at one point, we were always told, we were raised this way. Our parents taught us, our families taught us that you would never be welcome in a home like your home, that you would never be treated with respect and with love in a place like this. And we thank you for loving us, for teaching us something different than what we grew up understanding. They were taught a reverse prejudice, and it was so ingrained in them that it took living out the gospel to change their view, to change their worldview, so that they could see things completely different. You're holding in your hand a life. And the question for you and for me is, what are we doing with good news? Our heroes found a bounty. They found enough to take care of themselves, but also that entire city. And so they said to themselves, what are we doing with this good news? Why are we just sitting on this? Why aren't we going back to tell others about the good news? And I want to ask you, what are we doing with the good news that we have in Jesus Christ? What are we doing with that good news?